I think it's very hard, especially in state schools, where you've got 30, 35 pupils to every classroom. And, if you're a dyslexic kid that's not being disruptive but struggling, the teacher's not going to have the time or capacity.
I've worked in a mainstream school, and I wasn't that clued up on SEN then. But working in a specialist school, you can just see what work goes in, and you just think to yourself, wow, how do they get on? How do they survive in a mainstream school when you've got a class of 30 of all different needs, and you've got one teacher? How is that teacher going to get across to that one child? How are they going to make that difference? And that's what teachers are there for. Teachers are there to, educate you, get you ready for life outside of school, impact you in any way you can, inspire you. But it's hard for the teacher. It almost like putting him into an impossible role.
So the work that I do in mainstream differs hugely to the work that I do in specialists. So where I am based in one school at any one time, I can pop in to see children at any time of the day. I can see their journey. I'm available to go into lessons to do hands-on support. I can also take them for their one-to-one sessions, and I can ensure that this isn't in one of their primary subjects like maths, English or science. So I can really accommodate the timetable to ensure that they're accessing their learning whilst also accessing the additional support. Whereas in mainstream, because funding is so limited, resources so limited, your time is so restricted. So you go in for the day that you've been given, and you just have to see which children are available when. You also then don't necessarily have the time, or the teachers don't have the time to do the handover of what you've done with that child in the session. So then the carryover is really limited, whereas I'm based in the school that I'm able to deliver training sessions at lunchtimes. I'm in the staff room having lunch. We can have informal conversations about students. So there's that consistent carryover, which is really lacking in the mainstream environment. And also you just can't have the discussions with the teachers because they're teaching. So you're removing that child from the class, doing that intervention, which is really beneficial. They go back in. The next time you see them could be in 6 months' time. We don't know what's changed in that time. Have they put anything in place? So you start afresh every single time. So I think there's a massive, massive gap for therapy or intervention to be in mainstream schools because of the lack of resource available.
And I was a primary school teacher before I knew that I had, well, obviously I had dyslexia, but I didn't know that I had dyslexia. And interestingly, I was quite often given the sets with the lower attaining children, which was really interesting because actually, naturally, I was very good at teaching them because without realising it, I knew what they needed. And quite often, my children would catch up and make as much progress as the set above them. I think, as I said, my experience of being taught was not necessarily very positive. I think, if I can be controversial, I think teachers have a very tricky job because I think the breadth of needs in a class is very, very big these days, particularly since the pandemic. Teachers aren't experts in all areas of SEND. And I think they do the best they can, but being under-resourced and with limited training, I think sometimes that can be a bit of a barrier. In my personal experience, I found when advocating for my children, if I've told a teacher that they perhaps need a particular resource or need something presented slightly differently, most teachers are really understanding and are prepared to do that. Obviously, there's always some that kind of don't particularly get it, and that's okay.
So I'm a product of the state sector. I've been a state sector school governor. My children have also experienced state sector and private education. The teachers and colleagues that I've met and I have worked alongside do an absolutely wonderful job. It's phenomenal what they do with the restricted funds and resources that they have. But the reality for a child who has special educational needs in a mainstream classroom where you maybe have 30, 31, 32 children is that it's exceptionally difficult. It's really difficult for them to thrive in that sort of environment. And there needs to be more funding. There needs to be a huge amount of more funding for mainstream sector schools so that they can meet the needs of the pupils that they have in their classroom.
So teaching in a mainstream environment, obviously you have bigger classes, you've got 30 students. If you have children that are struggling, I would say if you have the resource to do small group work, whether that's with a teaching assistant, a learning support assistant, whoever is available for them, because actually in the specialist school you have small class sizes. So your targeted intervention is much more able for the children to access. Students with dyslexia especially, or people with dyslexia, often have slower processing. So the time it takes for them to understand the instruction or what they're reading and then put that into practice can be more difficult than other students. So within a mainstream classroom, if you're giving an instruction just verbally and you're not putting any visual supports on the board, that's going to take time for a child or student to understand what that means and follow through. So within our specialist setting, teaching in a positive way is really supported by visual strategies. So whenever you're giving an instruction, you're putting it on the board. We might have picture symbols for that. You break things down into smaller steps. You chunk information. If you're reading, you give them the visual so they can follow with their finger, for example. In a mainstream school, obviously that's a lot more difficult because you haven't got the time or resource to do that. However, if you can do small groups in mainstream, it can be really successful and children learn from other children.
I think some of the best techniques for teaching dyslexic people are based on meaning. So if you can try and find meaning in something, I think that hyper-focus aspect of a dyslexic brain quite likes that. Whether it be instead of taking a traditional phonics approach to learning how to spell or read by sort of sounding out words, you might instead take like a morphological approach where you take the individual meanings of each word and stick them together. That would be an example of a kind of a nice way for a dyslexic person to learn and in comparison to a neurotypical person.
When we got to my A-levels and did my A-level business studies, there was a teacher called John Caden, and the class was much smaller in A-level business studies, and he just had a way of bringing things to life. And I remember he would teach us things that we didn't need to know for exams. And that really played for me because it was a debate within the classroom over, I think one time he was teaching us about interest rates and inflation, but he was doing it in such a way that got everybody thinking about it and told the story of it and told the stories of what happened. And these things resonate with me still. I still remember these conversations that John used to have with us because he taught in just such a different way to the average. You could teach that story in such a different way. You could teach that story by going, this is what happens with inflation, this is what happens with interest rates, blah, 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 blah. But he was much more like, okay, let's picture a town. Let's get a big helicopter, and the helicopter throws in money into the town and then throws in more like, what's going to happen? And then gets us to try and answer the question, what's going to happen if we just keep chucking money into this town, and really played on it. And it was such a different way of teaching that I'd experienced before.
Typically what benefits one student benefits the class. So I would say for educators, it'd be great if when you're going and when you're, doing like a class reading or a novel, if you, while reading from the book, maybe got that YouTube, audio or wherever you get it and use that in your class. So you normalize it, right? Or you normalize every once in a while using speech to text or text to speech, or, if you're sort of writing notes on the board, use the text to speech app, right? Make it normal, make it seem just like another thing rather than something that's just only for the dyslexic kids,
One thing we can do as teachers is we can continue to acknowledge the hard work that our students are doing, particularly those with reading and writing challenges. I think it's really important that we try to be as explicit as we can when we're teaching something. So, for example, writing can be a very challenging thing for someone with dyslexia because, first of all, you might have many ideas that are coming into your mind, but if you don't feel like your spelling is of a level where you can record the vocabulary that you want to write, you want to be able to spell and write with the complexity that you're thinking, it can be very frustrating. And so I think really giving students skills where they can use apps where they can speak into, say, an iPad and it will record them is a really helpful tool. I think also for teachers to validate that as an okay way to record your ideas is really important. And I think in addition to being explicit about the spelling piece and recognizing that people with dyslexia who do have a writing challenge, their writing is not going to reflect in any way they're thinking. And we need to make sure that we are acknowledging that for them, that we're saying, we know that this is a difficult situation, or we know that this might be really frustrating because you're producing this in your written work, but we know your thinking is here, and helping students by validating their thinking and saying, we're going to help you get those ideas on paper.
So the educational landscape is changing a huge amount. We've got the introduction of assistive technology, we've got the introduction of artificial intelligence. What I would say to a teacher in a mainstream sector school is just research as much as you possibly can and put the child at the centre of any decisions that you're making. If AI works for them, great. Let's incorporate it into the lessons. I use a lot of artificial intelligence in my lessons because I do believe that AI levels the playing field for those children with SEN. Sometimes my children at my school will find it very difficult just to get the thoughts out of their head and down onto paper. So using AI can open up those doors and allow them to get started with whatever the project is that they're working on. Assistive technology, we use a lot of dictation, we use reading software. We really want to do whatever suits that individual child, and what works for one may not work for another. I have children that love to use dictation, use laptops, but I have other children that don't like that and they like to handwrite things, and that's great. So I think what I would say to any teachers in a mainstream sector classroom where you have a dyslexic pupil is just find out what works for that individual child and then do your absolute best as a teacher to try and make that lesson and the learning bespoke for them. And I appreciate that that's really difficult when you have a large number of children in your class, all with varying needs. It's not just going to be a dyslexic child in your class. You might have somebody with autism or auditory processing or occupational therapy needs. So I appreciate that it's really, really difficult, but a conversation with that child about what works for them and not making any assumptions is going to really help you as a teacher to be able to try and meet their needs.
I think one of the key things I've learned is giving people time. So often in a classroom, it's busy. We have to get through curriculum. We have certain amounts of content that we need to cover. And I think one of the biggest lessons that students that I've worked with that they've taught me is that sometimes we just need to slow down and we really just need to focus on one aspect of what we're doing. So for example, we might read a story. We might not read as much as I had intended, but if we really have time for students to think about what it is that that character is going through or try to draw connections, then it allows us to kind of go deeper. And I think that's been a really important piece. I think the other one is being as concise as we can, as well as explicit, because again, I know like in my classroom, sometimes I get really excited and passionate about something and I do a lot of talking, and then there's not enough space for students to do the talking, and a lot of processing can happen when you're talking things through verbally. And I think that's particularly important for our dyslexic students or anyone who has a reading or writing challenge, is that they have that opportunity to talk through something first before they start to try to write something down.
You need to adapt for every need. There are different tools. There are fidget toys, there are cushions, there is dictation, which I use so much in all of my lessons for my students. They wouldn't be able to do my lessons, so I teach BTEC sport. There's a lot of theory involved, and they don't think that when they first choose BTEC sport, they're like, brilliant, I'm going to play football, netball for like 5 hours a week. I love that, sir. And then I'm like, no, you've got to write this. They're like, what? I'm dyslexic, I can't do that. And I'm like, you've got dictate on there as a tool. And they're like, they know. And it just opens it up. It just opens up the world for them. They couldn't do it without it. They'd struggle. If you find yourself going home and having more bad days than good, you need to seek help yourself and seek different expertise, the SEN team, the therapy team, and say, look, I've given this kid 4 head teachers' attentions. Nothing's changed. I'm ringing mum and dad up saying, look, his behaviour is poor. Like, what's happening at home? And they're saying, well, not much. What's happening at school? I'm like, well, he keeps on getting kicked out because he can't concentrate. And I can sense them going, well, yeah, that's why we sent us to your school, Mr. Duke. Do you know what I mean? So I need to seek help. And then as a collaborative, you come together, you find the right approach. And there is always an approach there for every single student.
So I've been a teacher for over 20 years. I know you think that I don't look, I could have been teaching that long, but I have been a teacher for a long, long time. I have always had an interest and a passion for working with children with special educational needs. So even when I was doing my teacher training, I would volunteer to work in the learning support departments. I think what I would say throughout my career, if I reflect on it, definitely things have improved. 100% things have improved. We now have a better understanding of what dyslexia is, how it presents itself, and the strategies that we should be using to help those children within the classroom. We're not there yet. There's still a huge variance in how that support is delivered and how we try and meet those needs within the classroom.